The day I found out my ex-husband had remarried, I wasn't shocked at first. I mean, it had been years since we divorced, and I had accepted that he'd move on. But then came the invitation. It wasn't just a simple wedding invite. It was an invitation to a new chapter in his life, and I wasn't in it. He invited our children, his family, their friends, but not me. At first, I laughed. It was almost too absurd. Of course, I wasn't invited. Why would I be? The man I had spent over 20 years of my life with had found someone else, someone new to share his future with. But then I sat there, staring at the invitation, and the reality hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't wanted. I wasn't even a consideration in the life that he was starting with her. And that, for the first time in my life, made me feel so small. I wasn't angry, not at first. Honestly, I didn't even know how to feel. My first instinct was to laugh it off, pretend it didn't bother me. But deep down, something shifted. A part of me, the part that had always been there, the part that gave, and gave without asking for anything in return, suddenly began to wake up. I realized something important. I had spent too many years living for everyone else, trying to be everything for them, and in the process, I had lost myself. As I sat there alone with my thoughts, a wave of emotion came over me. I had poured my heart into my family, into him, into our children. I had done everything in my power to create a life for us, to make it all work, to be there for them in every way possible. But what was I left with? An invitation addressed to my children and the rest of the family, but not me. And that's when it happened. The thing I had never expected to happen. Instead of feeling sorry for myself, instead of being crushed under the weight of exclusion, I felt something stir inside me. Something fierce. Something that had been buried for so long, but was now clawing its way out. I knew then that I needed to stop being the invisible woman in my own life. The woman who was always there for everyone, always sacrificing, always putting others first. I needed to take control of my own story. I needed to do something for me. So I did. I didn't sit there feeling sorry for myself. I made a decision. I went out and bought the villa next door to my ex-husband's new wife. I know it sounds crazy, but that was the moment I stopped waiting for permission to be happy. I stopped waiting for someone else to invite me into their life. I bought that villa not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted to make him feel bad. No, I bought it because I wanted to take control of my life again. I wanted a space that was mine, a place where I could begin to heal, a place where I could rebuild. I wasn't going to let anyone erase me from my own story, and I wasn't going to be the woman who had to wait to be included. As I signed the papers for that villa, something inside me shifted. For the first time in years, I felt powerful. I felt like I was taking back the reins of my own life, the life I had let slip away over the years. I was no longer going to be the person who was pushed aside. Buying that villa wasn't just about the house. It was about my own empowerment, my own reclaiming of the life that I deserved. For so long, I had allowed myself to be the quiet, invisible woman. But no more. This was my moment to stand up, to take control, and to show myself that I was still capable of making choices, of creating a future for myself. And you know what? It felt incredible. The decision to buy the villa was more than just a change in my living situation. It was the moment I realized that I had been living for others for so long that I had forgotten what it meant to live for myself. The idea of owning something of my own, a space where I could heal, laugh, and just be me, filled me with a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. But there was something more to this, something deeper. The pain of being left out, the sting of being erased from my family's narrative. It woke something inside me, a fire that I didn't even know was there. I realized, as I walked through the empty rooms of the villa, that I was no longer the person I used to be. I wasn't the woman who waited in the wings for an invitation, for approval, for someone to see her worth. I was done with that. The months following the purchase of the villa were transformative. As I moved in and started settling into my new life, I found myself thinking back on everything I had sacrificed over the years. The things I had given up, the dreams I had pushed aside. For what? To be forgotten? To be left out of the most important moments of my life? I had spent so much time being everything for everyone else, and in doing so, I had lost myself. In the quiet of my new home, I began to reflect on the years I spent with my ex-husband, the sacrifices I made for my children, and the endless giving. I had always believed that love meant sacrificing everything for the ones you care about. But what I didn't realize was that true love, especially self-love, also means setting boundaries, knowing your worth, and honoring your own needs. I remember sitting on the balcony of my villa one evening, watching the sunset and thinking to myself, I deserve this. It wasn't just the villa I deserved. It was the life I was now building for myself. A life where I came first. A life where I no longer had to fight for attention or approval. A life where I could make decisions without worrying about whether they would upset anyone else. I could finally breathe. There were moments of doubt, of course. I won't pretend that it was all easy. There were nights when I missed my children, when I longed for the family I thought I had, the family I had fought so hard to keep together. But with each passing day, I realized that those years of sacrifice didn't have to define me. They were part of my story, but they didn't have to be the only chapter. I had allowed myself to become invisible for too long. It was time for me to step into the light and embrace the woman I was becoming, the woman who had control, who had a voice, and who deserved respect. It wasn't about my ex-husband or his new life. It wasn't about trying to prove anything to anyone. It was about reclaiming my own power. It was about learning to live for myself, to pursue my own happiness, and to be unapologetic about it. I had spent so many years serving others, but now it was time for me to serve myself. Every time I walked through the doors of my new home, I felt that sense of ownership, not just over the space, but over my life. I didn't need anyone's permission to be happy. I didn't need to be invited to the party anymore. I had my own party, my own life, and it was just getting started. The more I settled into this new chapter, the more I realized something. Sometimes life doesn't give you a choice. It doesn't always hand you the path you expect. But what you can do, what you must do, is take whatever path is available and make it your own. I had been handed a life that wasn't perfect, that wasn't easy, but it was mine. And I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. I started to get excited about the future, about all the possibilities that lay ahead. The world was still full of surprises, of challenges, and yes, of painful moments. But it was also full of opportunities. I had the power to shape my own destiny, and that thought filled me with a peace. And it wasn't just about moving into a new house. It was about moving into a new phase of life, a life where I could breathe deeply, laugh freely, and love without fear of being forgotten. And for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. As the weeks went by, the weight of my decision began to settle in. The villa was no longer just a physical space. It had become a symbol of something much more significant. It represented the freedom I had longed for, the life I had denied myself for so many years. And every corner of that house reminded me that I could finally start over. I remember one afternoon, sitting in the living room with the soft hum of the house around me. The place felt still, almost empty. But in that stillness, there was a quiet sense of peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't living for someone else. I wasn't trying to keep up with the demands of family or struggling to fit into a mold that never really suited me. I was living for myself, and that realization, simple as it may sound, was incredibly liberating. For so long, I had been the one to hold everything together. The holidays, the family events, the endless responsibilities. My ex-husband had moved on, and while I had accepted that, I realized that in the process of keeping the family together, I had lost myself. I had put everyone's needs before my own, without ever really considering what I wanted. It wasn't just about my ex-husband's wedding or the exclusion. It was about everything I had sacrificed without question. The truth was, I had been so focused on giving, on making everyone around me happy, that I forgot the most important thing. I deserved happiness too. I was allowed to have a voice, to have desires, and to build a life that was solely mine. I think that was the hardest part of all, learning to say no to the expectations of others and yes to myself. At first, it felt strange. I was used to being the person who always said yes, the one who accommodated everyone, even when it meant sacrificing my own well-being. But once I took that first step, once I decided that I would not allow my life to be dictated by others anymore, it became easier. Slowly, I started setting boundaries. I stopped answering every call, attending every family event, and offering help when I knew it would take away from my peace. I began to focus on what brought me joy, what made me feel alive. I started taking long walks through the garden of my villa, something I had never allowed myself to do before. I would read books I had put aside for years, and I rediscovered hobbies I had long abandoned. Painting, gardening, even just sitting outside with a cup of coffee and listening to the wind. It wasn't just about doing things I enjoyed. It was about rediscovering the woman I had lost. The woman who deserved joy. The woman who had dreams. The woman who didn't have to wait for permission to live her life fully. But of course, not everyone around me understood. My children, especially, had a hard time with the changes. I was their mother, after all, the one who had always been there for them. Now, I was the one setting boundaries, focusing on myself and living independently. For them, it felt like I was pulling away, and they didn't know how to handle it. There were phone calls, some awkward, some filled with confusion, even guilt. They didn't understand why I had made the decision to buy the villa next to my ex-husband's new wife. They thought I was trying to make a statement, to stir trouble, but in reality, it wasn't about him or his new life at all. It was about me. It was about showing them and myself that I wasn't just a caretaker. I was a woman with needs, desires, and a future to build. I was reclaiming my independence, my strength, and my sense of self. The truth is, setting boundaries isn't easy. It never is. It's uncomfortable at first, and it feels like you're pushing people away, even when all you're doing is pushing yourself toward a better life. But with every step I took toward reclaiming control of my life, I could feel myself getting stronger. And it wasn't just about independence, it was about something even more powerful: self-respect. I realized that I wasn't just taking control of my life in the sense of living where I wanted or spending time on the things I loved. It was deeper than that. I was taking control of how I viewed myself. I was no longer the woman who had to sacrifice everything to be loved or appreciated. I was no longer the woman who had to give without receiving anything in return. Instead, I was becoming the woman who valued herself enough to say, I deserve happiness too. I deserve to be seen. I deserve to be heard. And it wasn't just about doing things for myself. It was about choosing to stand in my own power and stop allowing my worth to be dictated by anyone else's expectations. I started to embrace my strength in ways I never had before. The more I lived for myself, the more I realized just how much power I had within me. The power to change my life, the power to set boundaries, the power to demand respect, not just from others, but from myself. Each day in the villa felt like another step toward the woman I was meant to be. No longer invisible, no longer second-guessing myself, no longer holding back. I was standing tall in my own story, and I wasn't going to let anyone erase me again. As I settled into my new home, my new life, I began to realize that my decisions, as empowering as they were for me, weren't going to be understood by everyone, especially not by my children. For so many years, I had been the one who made everything work for them, the one who always put them first. Now I was changing things. I was setting boundaries, living for myself, and in their eyes, pulling away. It wasn't just that they didn't understand the move. It was more complicated than that. My actions felt like a rejection, not just of their expectations, but of the role I had always played in their lives. I wasn't there to be their emotional caretaker anymore, and I wasn't waiting around for them to need me. It was a hard pill for them to swallow, especially after years of relying on me. My daughter, in particular, had trouble processing it. For her, I had always been the one who picked up the pieces when things fell apart, the one who would drop everything to help her, the one who would always answer the phone, no questions asked. And now, here I was living in my own space, taking control of my own happiness, and it felt like I was rejecting her. There were calls, many of them, but I didn't always pick up. I didn't respond right away. And when I did, the conversations were always strained. She would ask if I was okay, if everything was fine. But I could hear the worry in her voice, and it hurt me. It wasn't that I didn't want to talk to her. It wasn't that I didn't care. But the truth was I needed time. Time to adjust to this new life, to this new version of myself. I couldn't keep giving, not when I had nothing left to give. It was hard to hear her voice, filled with confusion and concern. But I knew that in the long run, this was the right thing for both of us. I had spent so many years accommodating everyone's needs. Always the one who had to make peace, the one who smoothed over conflicts, the one who took the emotional burden of the family. And now I needed to be the one to focus on myself, to heal, to rebuild. I remember one conversation with my son. He called and asked if I was okay with everything. "Are you sure about this, Mom? Are you sure about being on your own like this?" he asked, sounding genuinely concerned. And I said, "I'm sure. This is what I need right now. I need to take care of me. I need space to figure out who I am without always being the one who is needed by everyone else." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when he spoke again, there was something in his voice that made my heart ache. "I get it, Mom. I just wish we didn't feel so far from you." It was a simple statement, but it hit me hard. It wasn't that I had abandoned them, but it felt like they thought I had. I had given so much for so long that they never imagined that I could also have my own life, my own needs. It wasn't about rejecting them. It was about me finally accepting that I needed to be there for myself first. I couldn't keep carrying the weight of everyone else's emotions and struggles, but still, I let the silence sit between us. I wasn't going to jump in and fix things, not right away. They needed to learn, just as I had, that I wasn't going to be the same person anymore. I wasn't going to be their emotional crutch, their safety net. I had to be strong enough to let them process, to let them feel the space I had created. I didn't expect them to understand all at once, and I certainly didn't expect them to agree. But I knew that the more I allowed myself to stand firm, the more they would begin to understand. It was hard. It was painful, but it was necessary. I also realized that I wasn't the only one adjusting. My ex-husband had remarried, and while I had moved on in my own way, he had his own new life to figure out. The dynamics between us were changing, too, and not just because of the new wife. It was because I was no longer the person who would just go along with everything he wanted. I wasn't going to be invisible anymore. I wasn't going to fade into the background while everyone else got to live their lives the way they wanted. I was taking control, and that shift, as empowering as it was for me, was uncomfortable for everyone else. But they had to understand that I wasn't doing this to hurt them. I was doing it for me. And that, I realized, was the most important lesson I could teach them. How to stand up for yourself, how to protect your peace, how to be strong enough to live for yourself. Not to please others, but to be true to who you are. In the quiet moments of the days that followed, as I heard the phone ring or saw their names on a message, I felt the weight of my choices. But I didn't back down, not out of stubbornness, but because I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people feel the distance. Let them feel the space you've created so they can begin to understand the importance of setting boundaries. I wasn't disappearing from their lives. I was just no longer allowing myself to be the one they leaned on, the one they took for granted. I was choosing to be the woman I had always meant to be, the one who could love them, but also love herself. The more time I spent in my new villa, the more I realized how important it was for me to not only reclaim my life emotionally, but also financially. It wasn't just about living in a beautiful home or having the space to breathe. It was about standing on my own 2 feet in every sense of the word. I had spent so many years relying on others, first my husband, and then my ex-husband, for financial stability. But now I was responsible for my own happiness, my own decisions, and importantly, my own financial future. The more I thought about it, the more I understood that financial independence wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. For too long, I had given everything, emotionally, physically, and financially, and had nothing to show for it but a sense of depletion. I had always believed that if I just gave enough, if I was just patient enough, everything would work out. But that wasn't how life works. No one was going to hand me my future. I had to take it. The first step toward that was reviewing my finances. I remember sitting down with a cup of coffee, opening my bank statements, and taking a deep breath. There had been years of juggling bills, accounts, and household expenses. I had never taken a true look at where I stood financially because I was so focused on making sure everyone else was okay. But now things were different. I had always been good at managing the household finances, but managing my finances was a whole different ballgame. I had the means to make decisions for myself, to set goals, and to plan for my future without relying on anyone else. I wasn't just making sure there was enough for groceries or paying off the mortgage. I was thinking about things like retirement savings, emergency funds, and making sure I was financially secure for the years to come. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was planning for the future with the mindset that I deserved to have a future of comfort, of independence, and of security. I hired a financial advisor to help me set up some plans for the future. She was amazing. She didn't just help me with my investments, she helped me see my value. She helped me understand that I was worth taking care of. For the first time, I realized that I didn't have to be afraid of managing my money or of making decisions that were good for me. I started setting up accounts for my retirement, something I had always put off because I was so busy taking care of everyone else. I began looking into properties that could generate income, places that could give me a cushion for the future. I even started investing in stocks, something I had never done before, because I felt too overwhelmed to learn about it. But now, I felt ready. And most importantly, I began to understand the value of my time. I realized how much I had sacrificed my time and energy for others, often for little to no acknowledgement. The more I started to take control of my financial situation, the more I understood that my time was worth something too. I wasn't just a caretaker, a mother, a wife, or an ex-wife. I was a woman who had worked hard and deserved to enjoy the fruits of that labor. When I looked at my bank accounts and saw the numbers growing, I didn't just feel proud of myself for being financially responsible. I felt empowered. I realized that the more I took charge of my finances, the more I took charge of my life. No longer was I dependent on anyone else for financial stability. I had the power to decide where I wanted to live, what kind of life I wanted to lead, and how I wanted to spend my time. This wasn't just about having money. It was about freedom. Financial freedom gave me the ability to live my life on my own terms. I didn't need permission from anyone to live comfortably. I didn't need to explain why I spent money on things that made me happy. I could live, truly live, without the guilt I had carried for so many years. One of the most important things I learned during this period was that financial independence was more than just about money. It was about respect. I respected myself enough to take charge of my own future. I respected myself enough to not rely on others for the things I needed. I had spent so many years giving my time, my energy, my finances, and my heart to others. Now, it was time, and that, my friends, is something that I cannot stress enough. Financial independence isn't just a means to an end. It's a form of self-respect, self-love, and empowerment. It's about understanding that you have the right to live on your own terms without being dependent on anyone else. As I sat at my desk one evening, watching the sun set over my new home, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. I had worked for this. I had worked for every dollar that had gone into the house, for every investment I had made, for every choice I had made for myself. And it felt damn good. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just existing. I was thriving. I was taking control of my future, of my peace, of my life. And no one could take that away from me. As the days passed and my life in the villa began to settle into a rhythm, I realized that setting boundaries wasn't just about physical space. It was about emotional space, too. And that, as it turned out, was the most difficult part of all. For years, I had been the one to sacrifice, the one to give, the one to ensure that everyone else's needs were met before my own. I had done it with love, but also with a sense of obligation, as though my worth was tied to how much I could give to others. But now things had to change. I could no longer be the person who always said yes, the person who always put others first, the person who made herself last in line. I had to become someone who put herself at the top of her own priority list. And for someone like me who had spent her entire life putting everyone else's needs before her own, that was easier said than done. The first few times I said no felt foreign, almost unnatural. My children, especially, were so used to me being there for them, to being the one who would always take on whatever task was needed, whether it was financial support, emotional support, or just being a listening ear. When I started to say no, when I began to draw the line, it felt like I was being distant or unkind, even though I knew deep down that it was the only way I could truly be there for them in a healthy way. One afternoon, my daughter called asking me if I could help with something that in the past I would have immediately said yes to without hesitation. I took a deep breath and, for the first time, said no. I'm sorry, honey, but I can't do that right now. I need to take care of some things for myself. There was a pause, and then she responded, Are you okay, Mom? You've been distant lately. What's going on? And that's when I realized how much this shift was going to affect them. My no was not just a boundary, it was a change in how they saw me, how they interacted with me. And while I knew that this would be difficult for them to understand, I also knew that it was necessary. I'm okay, sweetheart, I said softly. I'm just learning how to take care of myself, and I need to do that right now. The conversation ended a little awkwardly, and I felt a pang of guilt. But as I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of relief. I had done something for me, something that I had never done before. I had said no, and I had taken care of my own needs. It wasn't easy, but it was empowering. Setting boundaries was about more than just protecting my time. It was about protecting my peace. It was about respecting myself enough to know that I couldn't keep giving without taking care of my own needs first. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when I was emotionally drained. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own happiness to please others. At first, I felt selfish, but as time went on, I realized that setting boundaries was not an act of selfishness. It was an act of self-respect. It was an act of self-love, and it was the only way I could truly be there for my family in a healthy, sustainable way. There were moments of tension. There were moments when I felt guilty for not answering every call or attending every family event. But those moments were fleeting. Slowly, I began to see the power of saying no. It wasn't just about protecting my time. It was about protecting my emotional well-being, my energy, and my peace of mind. I also started to set boundaries with my ex-husband. For years, I had allowed him to dictate parts of my life, even after our divorce. I had always been the one who would jump in to help him when he needed something, even when it meant sacrificing my own time. But now that was changing. I no longer felt the need to be at his beck and call, and I began to set limits on how involved I was going to be in his life. It wasn't about being angry or trying to get back at him. It was about knowing my worth. It was about understanding that I no longer had to live for the approval of others. I had the right to protect my time, my peace, and my energy. One day, I received a call from him. It was about some family matter, something he needed help with, and in the past, I would have dropped everything to take care of it. But this time, I didn't immediately say yes. I took a moment, considered what I needed, and then said, I'm sorry, but I can't do that right now. The silence on the other end of the line felt deafening. I could sense his surprise, maybe even his frustration. But I didn't flinch. I held my ground. I've been giving for so long, I continued. And now, I need to take care of myself. I hope you understand. There was a pause, and then he said, Okay, I understand. Take care of yourself. And with that, I hung up the phone. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel bad. I felt empowered. I had set a boundary, and I had done it for the right reasons. In the weeks that followed, I continued to establish boundaries, both with my family and with myself. I learned to say no when I needed to, and to prioritize my own well-being. I made time for myself in ways I had never done before. Whether it was taking a quiet walk in the garden, enjoying a cup of tea without any distractions, or simply sitting in silence and reflecting on how far I had come. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when I questioned if I was doing the right thing, moments when I missed the closeness I once had with my family. But in the end, I knew that these boundaries were necessary for my growth. They were necessary for my happiness. And as I stood in my villa, looking out over the horizon, I realized that I had done something incredible. I had given myself the gift of peace, the gift of self-respect, and the gift of freedom. I had learned to protect my heart, my time, and my energy. And I had learned that it was okay to put myself first. As I settled further into my new life, a life that I was finally able to call my own, I began to notice something shifting within me, a shift in perspective. The boundaries I had set, the space I had created for myself, it wasn't just about protecting my time or energy anymore. It was about seeing the world differently, about seeing myself differently. For so long, I had defined my worth by what I did for others. I had always been the one who gave, who helped, who sacrificed. My identity was tied to my role as a mother, a wife, an ex-wife, and someone who was always there for others. But now, with the walls of the villa around me and the freedom to live for myself, I started to redefine who I was, not based on the needs of others, but based on my own desires, passions, and dreams. It wasn't an easy process. There were days when I felt guilty for not being as available to my children, when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing. I'd spent so many years putting their needs above mine that stepping back and focusing on myself felt foreign. At times, I even wondered if I was being selfish. But deep down, I knew that what I was doing was necessary for my own growth. I couldn't keep pouring from an empty cup. If I didn't take care of myself, I wouldn't be able to show up for them in the way I truly wanted. One evening, as I sat in the garden of my villa, the cool breeze brushing my skin, I realized how much I had changed. The woman I was now was someone who wasn't afraid to stand up for herself, someone who valued her own well-being. I wasn't defined by the roles I had played for others. I was defined by who I chose to be in this new chapter of my life. I had started to view myself as someone worthy of respect, not just from others, but from myself. I had spent so many years second-guessing my worth, allowing people to take advantage of my kindness and generosity, thinking that's what love meant. But now I understood something that had eluded me for so long. Love begins with self-respect. This shift wasn't just about my relationship with my children or my ex-husband. It was about my relationship with myself. And once I started treating myself with respect, I noticed a change in how others treated me as well. My children, though still adjusting to the changes in our dynamic, began to see me differently. They began to understand that my decisions were not about abandoning them, but about showing them that self-respect and self-care are essential to living a full, happy life. One evening, my son called. The conversation was different this time. There was no tension, no awkwardness. He asked how I was doing, genuinely interested. "I've been thinking about you, Mom. You seem different in a good way. You seem happier." I smiled at his words, feeling the weight of years of sacrifice and self-doubt begin to lift. "I am happier," I said. "I'm learning to live for myself, to make decisions that are right for me. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm finally becoming the person I've always been meant to be." The silence on the other end of the line wasn't uncomfortable. It was understanding. And for the first time, I realized that my children didn't just see the woman who had always been there for them. They saw the woman I was becoming, the woman who had a voice, who knew her worth, and who wasn't afraid to stand up for herself. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Not just their acceptance of my new life, but my acceptance of myself. I realized that the most important relationship in my life wasn't the one I had with my ex-husband, or even my children. It was the relationship I had with myself. That shift in perspective changed everything. For so many years, I had placed all my energy into fulfilling the needs of others, thinking that was my purpose. But now I understood that my purpose was to live a life that was true to myself. It was to embrace who I truly was without apology. It was to create a life that reflected my values, my dreams, and my desires, not someone else's. And as I spent more time in my villa, surrounded by the space I had created, I began to appreciate the quiet moments, the ones where I could simply exist without the weight of expectation. The garden that I had lovingly tended to became a metaphor for the life I was now nurturing, a life of peace, self-respect, and personal growth. I realized that the journey I had been on wasn't just about reclaiming my space physically. It was about reclaiming my identity, my power, and my future. The more I embraced this new way of living, the more I saw the world with a different lens. I saw potential in myself that I had never allowed myself to acknowledge before. I saw possibilities for the future that were all mine to explore. But it wasn't just about me anymore. This change in perspective, this new way of living, was something I wanted to share with the women in my life, especially my daughters. I wanted them to understand that self-love and self-respect were not things to be ashamed of. I wanted them to know that they, too, deserve to put themselves first, to chase their own dreams, and to create a life that was fulfilling on their own terms. As I stood on the balcony of my villa one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized how far I had come. I had been through so much, years of sacrifice, pain, and emotional exhaustion. But now, I was living for myself. I was no longer the invisible woman. I was visible. I was strong. I was worthy. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Letting go is never easy, especially when it involves the people you've spent years loving and caring for. But as I stood there in the garden of my villa, feeling the cool breeze brush against my skin, I realized that letting go wasn't about giving up, it was about making space. Space for myself. Space for the life I deserved. I had spent so many years trying to hold on to my family, trying to keep everyone happy and connected, that I had neglected to acknowledge one important truth. Sometimes, holding on too tightly suffocates what you love. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is let go. I had always believed that love meant sacrifice, that I had to keep giving without question. But now, as I stood in my own home, having taken control of my life and my future, I saw the error in that belief. I realized that love, true love, includes taking care of yourself. It means knowing when to set boundaries, when to say no, and when to let go of things that no longer serve you. The process of letting go wasn't just about physical space. It wasn't just about moving into a new house or distancing myself from the emotional weight of my past. It was about emotional release. Letting go of the guilt, the self-doubt, the fear that if I didn't keep giving, I would be abandoned or unloved. The hardest part of letting go, I found, was releasing the idea that my worth was tied to my ability to please others. I had spent so much time bending over backward to meet the needs of my ex-husband, my children, and everyone around me, that I had forgotten who I was underneath it all. It was time to let go of that version of myself, the one who thought her value was based on her sacrifices. I started to see how I had built my entire identity around being needed. I had always been the one who gave. I had believed that if I kept giving enough, if I kept showing up for everyone, I would somehow be validated. But what I realized now was that validation had to come from within. I didn't need to prove my worth through endless acts of service. I didn't need anyone's approval to be proud of the woman I had become. Letting go of this old way of thinking wasn't easy. The guilt still crept in at times, especially when I felt like I was letting my children down by not always being there. There were moments when I questioned if I was being too distant, too selfish, and whether I was truly doing the right thing. But every time that doubt crept in, I reminded myself of something important. Self-care isn't selfish. In fact, it's the most selfless thing you can do because without it, you have nothing left to give. So I started small. I let go of the idea that I had to fix everything. I stopped trying to manage everyone else's emotions and decisions. I stopped jumping into every family crisis, every emotional drama. I gave myself permission to step back, to not have all the answers, to not always be the one to make everything better. I let go of the expectation that I had to carry the weight of everyone's happiness on my shoulders. But the real challenge came when I had to let go of the idea of what my family should be. I had spent years imagining that we would all stay close, that I would always be there for my children, and that they would always need me. But life doesn't always work out the way we plan it. My children were adults now, living their own lives, and they no longer needed me in the way they once had. And I had to learn to let go of that version of family, too. It was hard at first, especially when I saw them building their own families, carving out their own paths. There were times when I felt like an outsider in their lives, like they had moved on without me. But eventually, I came to realize that this wasn't rejection. It was just life. Life had changed. They were no longer children who needed a mother to handle everything. They were independent adults who had their own journeys to take. And I had to let go of the illusion that they needed me the same way they always had. Letting go didn't mean abandoning them. It didn't mean I loved them any less. In fact, I loved them more because I was learning to love myself. It meant that I had to let them grow, just as I was growing. It meant that I had to allow myself to have a life separate from theirs, a life that was just mine. And that was okay. I also had to let go of my attachment to the past. For so long, I had lived in the shadow of my previous life, clinging to memories of who I used to be, who we used to be as a family. But I realized that living in the past was only holding me back. I couldn't keep mourning the life I thought I would have. I had to let go of the what could have been and embrace the what is. The moment I started doing that, letting go of the expectations, the guilt, and the idea of who I was supposed to be, I started to feel lighter. It was like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I could breathe easier. I could think more clearly. And I could finally begin to envision a future that was all mine. A future where I could be the person I had always wanted to be, without apologies, without regrets. Letting go wasn't easy. It was painful. But in the end, it was the most freeing thing I had ever done. I had freed myself from the expectations of others. I had freed myself from the need to be perfect. And most importantly, I had freed myself from the idea that my worth was tied to what I could give to others. I had learned that my worth came from within. And that was a lesson I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Looking back at everything I had gone through, the years of sacrifice, the struggles, the heartache, and the eventual journey toward reclaiming my life, it became clear that every moment, every choice had been a lesson. It was as if life had been teaching me, step by step, what truly mattered and what didn't. And the more I learned, the more I realized how much power I had within me, power I had long neglected or forgotten. The first lesson I learned was the importance of self-worth. For so many years, I based my value on how much I could give to others, especially my family. I believed that if I gave enough, if I was always there, always doing something for someone else, I would be loved, appreciated, and valued. But what I came to understand was that true worth doesn't come from how much you give. It comes from who you are at your core. Your value is intrinsic, and it doesn't depend on anyone else's approval or validation. I realized that I had been living my life to please others, to fulfill roles I thought I was supposed to play. But in doing that, I had lost touch with who I truly was. When I finally decided to say no, to draw boundaries, to stop living solely for others, I discovered a deeper sense of self-respect. I learned that I didn't need anyone's permission to live a life that made me happy. I had the power to shape my own reality. The second lesson came from learning to set boundaries. Boundaries had always been a foreign concept to me. I had been the person who said yes to everything, who gave without hesitation, who tried to fix everything. But as I began to set healthy boundaries, I realized how much peace it brought me. I no longer felt drained by the constant demands of others. I learned that saying no didn't make me a bad person. It made me a strong one. It allowed me to preserve my energy, my time, and my happiness. At first, setting boundaries was uncomfortable. There were moments of guilt, moments when I questioned if I was doing the right thing. I feared disappointing my children or being misunderstood by my ex-husband. But with each no I spoke, I grew stronger. And the more I respected my own limits, the more others began to respect them as well. I realized that setting boundaries wasn't about pushing people away. It was about protecting myself and my peace. The third lesson I learned was the power of letting go. Letting go of the past, of guilt, of the idea that I had to be everything to everyone was one of the hardest but most necessary steps I took. For so long, I had clung to the idea of a perfect family, a perfect life. But life, as I now knew, wasn't perfect. People change, relationships evolve, and sometimes you have to let go in order to move forward. Letting go didn't mean abandoning my children or my past. It meant releasing the emotional burden that came with trying to control or hold onto things that were no longer serving me. I had to let go of the guilt of not always being there for them in the way they wanted me to be. I had to let go of the idealized image I had of what my life should look like. Once I did that, I was able to embrace the present, the reality of what my life was, and the possibilities for the future. And the fourth lesson I learned, one of the most important ones, was the power of financial independence. For years, I had been dependent on my ex-husband for financial stability, always worrying about whether we would have enough, whether I was contributing enough. But when I decided to take control of my finances, something incredible happened. I realized that I didn't need anyone to provide for me. I had the ability to make smart choices, to invest in my future, and to build a life of financial security for myself. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. Financial independence meant freedom of choice. It meant that I could live my life without worrying about how I would pay the bills, without constantly feeling like I was at the mercy of someone else's decisions. I could take risks, I could invest in my dreams, and I could create the life I wanted, not one I had to settle for. The fifth lesson was embracing change. Change, as difficult as it was necessary. I had spent so many years trying to hold on to things, trying to keep everything the same, even when it wasn't working. The more I embraced change, the more I realized that it wasn't something to fear. It was something to celebrate. Change was the beginning of new opportunities, new growth, and new possibilities. When I bought the villa, when I started living for myself, I was embracing a change that had been long overdue. And every day, I was reminded that change doesn't have to be scary. It can be a powerful force for good. Change meant I was no longer stuck in a life that wasn't fulfilling. It meant I was moving toward a future that was mine to shape. The final lesson I learned was the importance of self-love. It's easy to get caught up in caring for others, especially when you've been conditioned to do so. But if you don't take time to care for yourself, if you don't practice self-love, you have nothing left to give. Self-love isn't selfish, it's essential. It's about honoring your own needs, respecting your time, and prioritizing your well-being. And when you do that, you find that the love you give to others is deeper and more genuine because it comes from a place of abundance, not depletion. As I looked back on everything I had learned, I realized how far I had come. I was no longer the woman who was invisible, the woman who had been defined by what others needed from her. I was a woman who had taken control of her life, who had learned to say no, who had found the courage to let go of the past, and who had rediscovered her worth. The lessons I had learned were hard-earned, but they had made me stronger, more confident, and more at peace with who I was. And most importantly, they had taught me that I was worthy of a life filled with love, respect, and happiness, not just from others, but from myself. As the months passed and I found myself increasingly comfortable in my new life, I began to feel a sense of stability, a calm I hadn't known in years. For the first time, I wasn't constantly juggling other people's needs or living for their approval. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. The woman who once felt invisible, overwhelmed, and lost had transformed into someone who knew her worth, who was at peace with herself, and who was determined to make the most of every single day. It wasn't that everything had magically fallen into place. The pain of my past still lingered. There were moments when I missed the family I thought I had, when I longed for the connection that had once been so strong. I missed the holidays, the gatherings, the feeling of being needed. But I realized that I didn't need to hold on to those memories in order to move forward. I could still cherish those moments, but I didn't need them to define who I was now. I had the power to create new memories, new experiences, and new connections. And that's exactly what I did. I started to find joy in the simple things. I took long walks around my garden, planted new flowers, and watched them bloom. I allowed myself to sit in silence, enjoying my own company without guilt. I started to pick up old hobbies that had long been neglected: painting, reading, writing. These were the things that filled my heart with joy and gave me a sense of purpose that didn't depend on anyone else. I also started to reconnect with friends, many of whom I had lost touch with over the years, as I focused so much on my family. We laughed, we reminisced, and we shared stories of our lives, of the challenges we had faced, and the ways we had grown. It was a reminder that life wasn't just about family, it was about the connections we form with others, the people who truly see us and accept us for who we are. But as much as I began to rediscover myself, there was still something deep within me that felt incomplete. I had set boundaries, I had learned to take care of myself, but I still missed the feeling of being truly seen and valued by my children. It wasn't that I wanted them to worship me or to praise me for the decisions I had made. It was something deeper. I wanted them to understand the woman I had become, to see that I wasn't just their mother. I was a person in my own right, with my own dreams, with my own story. I knew that healing wasn't going to be an overnight process. I knew that it would take time for my children to fully understand why I had made the choices I did, and why I needed to step back from the role I had always played. But I also knew that I couldn't wait forever for them to come around. I couldn't live in a state of limbo, hoping that they would one day see me the way I wanted them to. The only way forward was to continue living my life with the same courage and conviction that had brought me this far. One day, after months of living in my villa, I received a message from my daughter. It had been a while since we'd spoken. The distance between us had been palpable, but I had held firm in my decision to focus on myself and to respect my own boundaries. The message was simple: can we talk? I was nervous, unsure of how the conversation would go, but I agreed to meet her at a cafe. And when we sat down, there was a quiet understanding between us. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Mom," she said, "I've been thinking about everything. I've realized that you're right. You've always given so much, but you've never asked for anything in return. And now I see that you deserve more. I see you, Mom. I see you for the first time in a long time." Hearing those words was like a weight being lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. I felt heard. It wasn't about them suddenly understanding everything. I didn't expect that. But it was a sign that they were starting to see the person I was becoming, the person who had always been there but had been hidden beneath the weight of expectations. We talked for hours that day. It wasn't just about apologies or explanations. It was about building a new foundation, one based on mutual respect, understanding, and love. It was about reconnecting, not in the way we had before, but in a way that honored who we were as individuals. As I walked away from that conversation, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. I had done the hard work of reclaiming my life, of standing up for myself, and of setting boundaries. And now, I was starting to see the fruits of that labor. Not just in the way I felt about myself, but in the way my children were beginning to see me as well. I realized that this journey wasn't just about healing from the past. It was about creating something new. A new relationship with myself, a new relationship with my family, a new relationship with life. I was no longer the person who was waiting for an invitation. I was no longer the woman who lived in the shadows of everyone else's needs. I was the woman who had taken control of her own life, and in doing so, had created a life that was truly hers. Moving forward wasn't going to be easy. There would still be moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if I was doing the right thing, moments when I missed the life I thought I would have. But I had learned one important thing. It was okay to let go of the past. It was okay to move forward, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. And with each new day, I found that the future didn't seem so daunting after all. It was full of possibilities, full of potential. I had the power to create the life I wanted, and I was finally living it. Looking out over the horizon from my villa, the sun dipping below the trees and casting a golden glow across the landscape, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come. It felt like I had lived a lifetime in the past few years, years of sacrifice, pain, and struggle, followed by years of rediscovery, healing, and growth. And yet, as I sat there, I realized that this was only the beginning. I had taken control of my life in ways I had never thought possible. I had set boundaries, rebuilt my sense of self-worth, reclaimed my independence, and let go of the past. I had learned to live for myself, not in the shadow of others' expectations, but on my own terms. I had come a long way from the woman who had been invisible, the woman who had given everything without receiving anything in return. But despite everything, I knew that the journey wasn't over. In many ways, it had only just begun. I had created a life that was mine, but that didn't mean I had to stop growing. It didn't mean that I wouldn't face challenges or setbacks. It didn't mean that I wouldn't continue to have doubts or moments of fear. What it meant was that I was no longer afraid to face those challenges. I was no longer afraid to face the unknown. I had lived too long in the shadow of my own fears and insecurities. But now I had the courage to step into the light and embrace whatever came next. There was something deeply freeing about knowing that I had the power to decide what my future looked like. I didn't need permission from anyone else. I didn't need anyone to validate me or approve of the choices I made. The only person I needed to answer to was myself. I had learned that the key to happiness wasn't about having everything go according to plan. It wasn't about living a life without pain or without challenges. It was about embracing the messiness of life and finding peace in the midst of it. It was about being okay with imperfection and knowing that I was enough just as I was. One of the things I had always longed for was connection. Deep, meaningful relationships with my family, with my children. And while I had begun to rebuild those connections, I understood that it would take time. There was no magic fix, no perfect resolution. Relationships, like everything else, required effort and understanding, especially when you've spent so many years living in one way and then suddenly decided to change everything. But I was willing to put in the work. I was willing to meet my children where they were and show them, in time, that my choices were made out of love, not out of rejection. And then there was me. I had spent so many years giving to others that I had forgotten to give to myself. But now I was learning to nurture my own soul, to make time for the things that brought me joy, to allow myself to rest, to laugh, and to just be. For the first time in my life, I was living in alignment with who I truly was. I began to take trips to places I had always dreamed of visiting, small, quiet towns in the countryside, places by the ocean, where I could just breathe and reconnect with myself. I started exploring passions I had long forgotten, writing, art, and even volunteer work, giving back in ways that felt fulfilling and true to my heart. In these quiet moments of reflection, I realized that the most important lesson I had learned was this. Life is a journey, and it's okay to take it one step at a time. The world is full of possibilities, and I was no longer afraid to step into them. I wasn't waiting for someone else to tell me how to live. I wasn't waiting for anyone to invite me into their life. I had created my own space, and it was beautiful. Looking forward, I didn't know exactly what the future would hold. But I knew this. I was no longer the woman who was invisible. I was the woman who had learned to stand tall, to speak her truth, and to embrace her own power. I was the woman who had finally found peace with herself, and that peace would guide me through whatever came next. The journey would continue with all its ups and downs, its twists and turns. But for the first time, I was truly ready for it. I was ready to live fully, to love deeply, and to embrace every part of who I was. And in doing so, I knew that the next chapter of my life would be even more rewarding than the last. Because now I was living for me.